"You are not here to clean my house," Ethan Cole said coldly, his voice echoing through the marble hall. "You are here to prove that every person has a price." The words landed like a slap in the silence of the penthouse, sharp, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Lily Carter stood still, her fingers tightening slightly around the handle of her worn suitcase, the only thing she owned that had survived the last 3 years of her life. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan stretched endlessly, glowing with power and money, a world she had never belonged to. Inside, the air felt even colder than the winter night beyond the glass. Ethan watched her closely, his dark eyes calculating, waiting for the flicker of greed, fear, or desperation that he believed lived inside everyone. He had built his empire on that belief. People were predictable. People were weak. And tonight, this quiet girl standing in front of him would be no different. Or at least, that was what he intended to prove. Lily lifted her gaze slowly, meeting his eyes without defiance, without submission, just a calm steadiness that did not match her situation. "I am here to work, sir," she said softly. No trembling, no hesitation, just a simple truth. For a brief second, something unreadable crossed Ethan's face, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "We will see," he replied. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Ethan turned away as if dismissing her existence entirely, walking toward the living room where a crystal glass of untouched whiskey sat waiting. Everything in his home was perfect, controlled, untouched by chaos. Except now, there was her. Lily followed the house manager down a long corridor lined with abstract paintings that probably cost more than any home she had ever known. Her shoes made almost no sound against the polished floor, but her presence felt loud in a place like this, like a foreign note in a carefully composed symphony. "You will follow the schedule exactly," the manager said without looking at her. "Mr. Cole does not tolerate mistakes." Lily nodded, though her attention drifted briefly to a small detail most would miss. On a side table near the hallway, a single photograph sat slightly out of alignment, as if someone had once touched it and never returned it properly. She reached out instinctively, straightening it by a fraction of an inch. The movement was small, almost invisible, but it was the first time something in the house had been gently corrected rather than controlled. From across the room, unseen by her, Ethan noticed. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in curiosity. Most people overlooked details unless there was something to gain. Yet she had done it without hesitation, without audience, without reward. He took a slow sip of his drink, his mind already adjusting the rules of the game. This would not be a simple test. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan Cole felt something unfamiliar stir beneath his carefully constructed indifference. Not trust, not yet, but something dangerously close to interest. The next morning arrived without warmth. Sunlight poured through the massive windows of Ethan Cole's penthouse, but it did nothing to soften the sharp edges of the space. Everything remained exactly where it had been the night before, precise, untouched, controlled. Everything except Lily. She moved quietly through the kitchen, her steps measured, her presence almost invisible. Yet somehow, the air felt different, as if something small and uninvited had begun to breathe inside the stillness. Ethan noticed it immediately. He stood near the entrance, watching without announcing himself. Lily did not see him. She was focused on something simple, something that should not have mattered in a house like this. A single ceramic cup sat on the counter, slightly chipped along the rim. It did not belong among the polished perfection of imported glassware and designer sets. Yet instead of discarding it, Lily rinsed it carefully, drying it with a clean cloth before placing it gently back in the cabinet, separate from the rest, as if it still deserved a place. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Most employees replaced, removed, optimized. They followed instructions. They did not assign value to imperfections. That was not their role. He stepped forward then, his shoes breaking the silence just enough to make her turn. For a fraction of a second, her shoulders tensed, a small, human reaction she could not fully hide. Then it was gone, replaced again by that same calm composure. "Why did you keep that cup?" Ethan asked, his tone neutral but sharp underneath. Lily glanced at the cabinet before answering. "It still works," she said simply. Throwing it away would not fix anything. Ethan studied her face, searching for something behind the words. An angle, a strategy, something to confirm what he already believed. "You are not here to decide what stays and what goes," he replied. "You are here to follow instructions." "Yes, sir," she said softly. No argument. No apology. Just acceptance. It irritated him more than defiance would have. He turned away, but his mind did not move on. Instead, it adjusted. The first test had been observation. The second would require pressure. Later that afternoon, Ethan arranged it carefully. A meeting had been scheduled in the penthouse with 3 business partners, men who respected power and exploited weakness. Lily was instructed to serve drinks. Nothing unusual, nothing beyond her role. But as she entered the room carrying a silver tray, Ethan shifted slightly in his seat and extended his hand at the exact moment she stepped forward. The tray tilted. Crystal glasses collided. Red wine spilled across the white marble floor, staining it like a wound. The room went silent for half a breath before one of the men let out a low, amused laugh. "Careless," another muttered. Ethan did not look at the mess. He looked at her. "Clean it," he said coldly. Lily stood frozen for a brief moment, her fingers tightening around the edge of the tray, her breath catching just enough to reveal the pressure beneath her calm. Then she knelt down without a word. No excuses. No pleading. She gathered the broken glass carefully, ignoring the faint sting as one small shard grazed her skin. A thin line of red appeared against her finger, but she did not react. She focused only on restoring order. One of the guests leaned back in his chair, watching with open amusement. "You should hire better staff," he said. Ethan did not respond. His attention remained fixed on Lily. He had expected something else. Panic, anger, a flash of resentment. But there was none. Only quiet persistence. When she finished, she stood, holding the empty tray with steady hands. "Would you like me to bring fresh drinks?" she asked. The question was simple, professional, unchanged by what had just happened. Something shifted again inside Ethan, subtle but undeniable. Not trust, not respect, not yet, but the certainty he had carried for years, the belief that everyone would eventually reveal their weakness, felt just slightly less absolute. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. That night, the penthouse returned to silence, but it was no longer the same silence. Something invisible had shifted, subtle enough that no one else would notice, but strong enough that Ethan Cole could not ignore it. He stood alone in his study, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass. Yet his attention remained fixed on a single detail from earlier that day. The way she had not defended herself. The way she had not tried to explain. The way she had simply continued. It did not fit. It did not follow the pattern he had spent years mastering. People always revealed themselves under pressure. Always. He poured himself another glass of whiskey, but even the familiar burn did not settle his thoughts. Across the penthouse, Lily moved quietly through the hallway, finishing the last of her assigned tasks. The house manager had long since left, leaving her alone in a space that felt far too large for one person. She paused briefly near the window, her reflection faint against the dark glass. For a moment, her calm expression softened, the weight she carried slipping through the cracks. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the cloth she held, and her shoulders dropped as she let out a slow breath. It was the first moment she allowed herself to feel the exhaustion. Then, just as quickly, she straightened again, folding the cloth neatly and continuing her work as if nothing had happened. She did not know that Ethan was watching from the far end of the hallway, hidden in the shadow where the light did not reach. He had not intended to follow her. He had simply moved without thinking, drawn by something he could not yet name. Most employees changed when they believed no one was watching. Masks slipped. Complaints surfaced. Resentment found a voice. But Lily did none of those things. Instead, she worked with the same quiet consistency, even in solitude. Ethan frowned slightly, unsettled by the absence of contradiction. The next morning, the test escalated. He did not announce it. He did not need to. Power, when used correctly, did not require explanation. Lily was called into the living room shortly after sunrise. The space was immaculate, every surface reflecting light in perfect symmetry. Ethan stood near the center, holding a small envelope between his fingers. His expression was unreadable, but there was something sharper beneath the surface, something more deliberate than before. "You made a mistake yesterday," he said calmly. as if discussing a minor inconvenience. Lily lowered her gaze slightly. Yes, sir. Mistakes have consequences, he continued. He stepped closer, extending the envelope toward her. Inside is $10,000. Take it, and I will forget what happened. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Lily did not reach for it. Her eyes flickered briefly to the envelope, then back to him. I do not understand, she said quietly. Ethan's lips curved faintly, not into a smile, but something colder. It is simple. Take the money, admit you are not suited for this job, and leave. No record. No consequences. Just an easy exit. Silence stretched between them. For the first time, the test was no longer about obedience. It was about choice. About value. About what she believed she was worth. Lily's fingers tightened slightly at her sides, the smallest tremor passing through her before she stilled it. She looked at the envelope again, and for a brief second, something deeper moved behind her eyes. Not greed. Not temptation. Something heavier. Memory, perhaps. Then she lifted her gaze to meet his. If I leave, she said softly, then I am accepting something I did not earn. Ethan's eyes sharpened. Everyone accepts what they can get, he replied. That is how the world works. Lily shook her head. Just once, a small but certain motion. Maybe that is how your world works, she said. But it is not mine. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Tighter. Charged. Ethan did not move. For the first time, the certainty that had guided him for years met resistance that did not break, did not bend, and did not ask for anything in return. Slowly, he lowered the envelope, his gaze never leaving her face. The test had not gone as expected, and for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Cole did not know what the next move should be. The rest of the day passed with an unusual tension that neither of them acknowledged out loud. Ethan returned to his work, but his focus fractured in ways that had never happened before. Numbers, contracts, projections, all of it blurred at the edges, interrupted by a single, persistent thought. She had refused. Not dramatically, not rebelliously, but quietly, firmly, without hesitation. It was not defiance. It was something far more difficult to control. Across the penthouse, Lily continued her tasks as if nothing had happened. She cleaned, organized, restored order to spaces that had never truly been disturbed. Yet the longer she moved through the rooms, the more she noticed what others had ignored. The house was perfect, but it was not lived in. No warmth. No presence. Just precision. In the late afternoon, she entered a smaller sitting room near the far end of the hallway, a space that seemed almost forgotten. The furniture was covered in a thin layer of dust, untouched for what felt like months, maybe longer. Sunlight filtered in through tall windows, catching particles in the air that drifted slowly like suspended time. Lily stepped inside carefully, as if she were entering something fragile. On a low table near the window, she noticed a small object resting alone. A framed photograph. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge. The image showed a younger Ethan, his expression softer, standing beside a young girl who could not have been older than 16. She was smiling brightly, her hand gripping his sleeve as if he were the center of her world. The contrast was striking. This version of Ethan felt almost like a stranger. Lily studied the photograph for a moment longer, something quiet, an understanding passing through her expression, before she gently wiped the dust from the frame and set it back exactly where it had been. She did not move it. She did not rearrange the space. She simply restored it. From the doorway, unseen again, Ethan stood still. He had not meant to come here. He had not stepped into this room in over a year. Yet somehow, he found himself drawn back, just in time to witness something he did not expect. His gaze locked onto the photograph in her hands, and for a brief moment, something sharp flickered across his face. Not anger. Something deeper. Something buried. Lily turned slightly as if sensing a presence, and when she saw him, she immediately lowered her hands, stepping back. I am sorry, sir, she said softly. I did not mean to touch anything personal. Ethan did not respond right away. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph, now clean, now visible again in a way it had not been before. The dust was gone. The neglect erased. Who told you to come in here? He asked finally, his voice quieter than usual, but edged with something dangerous beneath it. No one, Lily answered honestly. I was cleaning the rooms that had not been used. Silence stretched between them. The air in the room felt heavier, as if the past itself had been disturbed. Ethan stepped forward slowly, his gaze shifting from the photograph to her face, searching again for motive, for calculation, for anything that would make sense of what she had done. "You should not touch things you do not understand," he said. Lily nodded slightly, accepting the reprimand without argument. "Yes, sir." She turned to leave, but before she could take more than a step, Ethan spoke again. "Why did you clean it?" he asked. The question was quieter, almost reluctant, as if he had not intended to say it out loud. Lily paused, her back still turned to him. For a moment, it seemed like she might not answer. Then she did. "Because someone cared about it once," she said gently. "And things like that should not be left forgotten." Ethan felt the words settle into the space around him, heavier than any accusation. He looked at the photograph again, really looked this time, and for the first time in a long while, the carefully controlled walls he had built inside himself shifted, just slightly. Not enough to break, not enough to show, but enough to let something through. Lily did not wait for a response. She continued out of the room, her steps quiet, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt empty, but full of something Ethan had spent years trying not to feel. The house did not change overnight, but something inside it had begun to shift, quiet and almost invisible, like the first sign of warmth after a long winter. Ethan Cole noticed it in the smallest details, though he refused to name it. The air no longer felt as heavy when he walked through the halls. The silence, once sharp and absolute, now carried something softer beneath it. And somehow, against all logic, it traced back to her. Lily Carter moved through the penthouse with the same quiet discipline. But her presence left behind something different than before. Not disruption, not control, something closer to care. That evening, as the city outside turned gold with the setting sun, Lily entered the kitchen to prepare the final tasks of the day. She paused briefly when she noticed a small indoor plant near the window, its leaves dry and curling inward, its soil cracked from neglect. It had likely been placed there for decoration, chosen for appearance rather than attention, and then forgotten. She knelt beside it, touching the brittle edge of one leaf with careful fingers. "You are still alive," she murmured softly, more to herself than anything else. She filled a small glass with water and poured it slowly into the soil, giving it just enough, not too much, as if she understood something delicate about balance. She moved it slightly closer to the light, adjusting its position by inches rather than forcing change. It was a small act, insignificant in a place filled with wealth beyond measure. But it was real. From across the room, Ethan stood watching again, his presence silent but deliberate. He had not planned to come here. Yet once more, he found himself drawn to the same quiet pattern. She did not perform kindness. She did not seek recognition. She acted as if the world still deserved care, even when no one was watching. It unsettled him more than any argument ever could. "Why are you wasting time on that?" he asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the stillness. Lily looked up, her hand still resting lightly against the edge of the pot. For a brief second, surprise crossed her face, but it faded quickly. "It is not a waste," she said gently. "It just needs attention." Ethan stepped closer, his gaze sharp, searching for weakness, for naivety, for anything that would confirm what he believed. "It is a decoration," he said. "If it dies, it will be replaced." Lily shook her head slightly. "That does not mean it does not matter." The words were simple, but they lingered in the space between them. Ethan looked at the plant, then back at her, his expression tightening just enough to reveal the conflict beneath. He had built his life on replacement. Efficiency. Control. Nothing was meant to last unless it served a purpose. And yet, she stood there, assigning value to something that offered nothing. In return, "You are here to work," he reminded her. "Not to care about things that are irrelevant." Lily lowered her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the plant before answering. "Sometimes the smallest things are not irrelevant," she said softly. "They are just easy to ignore." Ethan did not respond immediately. The room felt different again, as if her words had settled into places he had long kept closed. He turned away without another word, but his steps were slower than before, less certain. Later that night, long after the penthouse had gone quiet, Ethan returned to the kitchen alone. The city lights reflected faintly across the glass, casting shadows that moved with the distant traffic below. His eyes went immediately to the plant. It looked the same, and yet not. The leaves were still fragile, still uncertain, but there was something else there now. A possibility. He stood there for a moment, staring at it as if it held an answer he could not yet understand. Then, almost without thinking, he reached for the glass Lily had used earlier. He filled it halfway with water, hesitated, then poured just a little more into the soil. Not enough to fix anything. Not enough to change the outcome, but enough to try. And as he set the glass back down, Ethan Cole realized something that unsettled him more than any test he had designed. For the first time in years, he had done something without expecting anything in return. The following morning, something subtle but undeniable had changed inside the penthouse, though neither Ethan nor Lily spoke of it. The plant by the window stood quietly in its place, its leaves still fragile, still uncertain, but no longer entirely lifeless. Lily noticed it the moment she entered the kitchen. She paused for just a second, her eyes scanning the soil, the slight shift in moisture, the faint adjustment in position. Someone had touched it. Someone had cared. She did not smile, but something softened in her expression before she continued with her work. Across the room, Ethan stood watching again, his presence as controlled as ever, but his thoughts no longer aligned with the rigid certainty he once carried. He had told himself the night before that it meant nothing, a meaningless action, a moment of distraction. But now, seeing her notice it without surprise, without question, unsettled him in a different way. It was as if she had expected it, as if she had already seen something in him that he had not yet accepted himself. You moved it closer to the light, Lily said quietly, still facing the plant. It was not a question. Ethan crossed his arms slightly, his expression guarded. It needed it, he replied, his tone neutral, almost defensive. Lily nodded once, acknowledging the truth without making it larger than it was. Yes, it did. Silence followed, but it was not the same silence as before. It carried something unspoken, something that neither of them seemed ready to define. Ethan broke it first. Do not assume that changes anything, he said, his voice sharper now, as if trying to re-establish control over something slipping beyond his grasp. Lily turned then, meeting his gaze calmly. I did not assume anything, she said. I just noticed. Her words landed gently, but they carried weight. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary before looking away. He needed distance. He needed clarity. And more than anything, he needed to remind himself why this had started in the first place. That afternoon, the next test came without warning. Ethan had arranged for a delivery to arrive at the penthouse, a large sealed envelope containing a set of documents and a small stack of cash. It was placed deliberately on the entry table, visible but unmentioned. A trap, simple in design but effective in principle. Anyone tempted would reveal themselves without being asked. Lily discovered it while completing her usual routine. She stopped briefly, her eyes resting on the envelope. She did not touch it. Instead, she checked the label, noting the name and the lack of instruction. For a moment, she hesitated, not out of temptation, but out of uncertainty about where it belonged. Then she carried it directly to Ethan's office, knocking softly before entering. Ethan looked up as she stepped inside, his attention immediately shifting to the envelope in her hands. This was left at the entrance, Lily said, placing it carefully on his desk. There were no instructions. Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her. Did you look inside? He asked. Lily shook her head. No, sir. A pause followed. You are sure? He pressed. Lily met his gaze without flinching. If it is not mine, then it is not something I should open. Ethan's fingers tapped lightly against the desk, a habit that surfaced only when his thoughts moved faster than his control. This test had been designed to be effortless. Temptation without pressure. Opportunity without consequence. And yet, once again, she had stepped around it as if it had never existed. You can leave it there, he said finally. Lily nodded and turned to go, but before she reached the door, Ethan spoke again. Most people would have looked, he said, his voice quieter now, less certain than before. Lily paused, her hand resting lightly on the door. Maybe, she said, but most people are used to taking things when no one is watching. She glanced back at him briefly. I am not. She left the room without waiting for a response, the door closing softly behind her. Ethan remained still, his eyes fixed on the envelope in front of him. For the first time, the test itself felt irrelevant. What mattered was the pattern that continued to emerge, the one thing he had not accounted for. She was not reacting to the situation. She was acting from something deeper, something that did not shift with pressure, money, or opportunity, and that made her dangerous to everything he believed about the world. Because if she was real, then everything he had built his life on might not be. That evening, the city outside pulsed with life, but inside the penthouse, everything slowed into something quieter, more deliberate. Ethan Cole stood by the window, his reflection faint against the glass, his thoughts no longer aligned with the certainty that had once defined him. Every test he had designed had followed the same pattern: pressure, temptation, exposure. And every time, Lily Carter had responded in a way that did not fit. It was not resistance. It was not submission. It was something steady, something rooted deeper than circumstance. That unsettled him more than failure ever could. Across the penthouse, Lily worked through her final tasks, her movements calm, consistent, almost rhythmic. Yet there was something different tonight. Not in what she did, but in how she moved, as if she were more aware of the space around her, more attuned to something unseen. She paused briefly in the hallway near the smaller sitting room, her eyes drifting toward the photograph she had cleaned the day before. For a moment, she stood still, studying it again, as if confirming something she had already understood. Then she spoke, softly, almost to herself. "She meant a lot to you." The words were quiet, but they carried clearly through the open space. Ethan, standing just out of view, felt his body go still. He had not made a sound. He had not revealed his presence. Yet somehow, she had spoken directly into something he had buried. He stepped forward slowly, his expression sharpening, his control returning as instinct took over. "You should not make assumptions," he said, his voice firm but lower than usual. Lily turned, her expression calm but no longer distant. This time, there was something else there. Not curiosity, not fear, recognition. "It is not an assumption," she said gently. "It is in the way you look at it." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "You are overstepping," he replied. Lily lowered her gaze briefly, acknowledging the boundary, but when she looked back up, her voice remained steady. "I am sorry if it seems that way," she said. "I just recognize it." Ethan's eyes narrowed. Recognize what? There was a pause then, longer than before. For the first time since she had arrived, Lily hesitated not because of fear, but because of something personal. Her fingers moved slightly at her side, brushing against the edge of the fabric she always kept with her, the old, worn cloth she carried everywhere. Then she spoke. "Losing someone you could not protect." The words landed quietly, but they struck deeper than anything else she had said. Ethan felt it immediately, a sharp, involuntary reaction that he masked almost instantly. "You do not know anything about me," he said, his tone colder now, defensive in a way it had not been before. Lily nodded once. "That is true," she said, "but I know what it looks like." Silence followed, heavy and unmoving. Ethan searched her face again, but this time, he was not looking for deception. He was looking for something else, something that might explain how she had stepped so close to something he had never spoken out loud. "How?" he asked finally, the word quieter than he intended. Lily's gaze softened slightly, but she did not look away. "Because I have seen it before," she said. "In a hospital room." The space between them shifted again, the distance no longer defined by status or control, but by something shared, something unspoken. Ethan felt the ground beneath his certainty crack, just enough to let doubt in. "You are assuming too much," he said again, but this time, the words lacked conviction. Lily did not argue. She did not push further. "Maybe," she said softly, "but I do not think so." She turned then, continuing down the hallway as if the moment had passed, leaving Ethan standing in the same place, his thoughts no longer steady, no longer controlled. He looked back at the photograph, then at the empty space where she had stood. For the first time, the test no longer felt like something he controlled. It felt like something he was losing. Not to her, but to the truth she seemed to carry without trying. And that truth was beginning to reach places inside him he had spent years trying to keep closed. The next morning carried a tension that lingered beneath every movement, every glance, every unspoken thought. Ethan Cole had not slept well, though he would never admit it. The conversation from the night before echoed in his mind with an intensity he could not ignore. Losing someone you could not protect. The words had not just reached him. They had found something precise, something buried with intention. And that was what unsettled him the most. She had not guessed. She had known. Across the penthouse, Lily Carter moved through her routine as she always did, calm and steady, but there was a subtle shift in her awareness. She no longer moved like someone simply doing a job. She moved like someone who understood the weight of the space she occupied. She noticed the way Ethan avoided the sitting room now, how his steps changed slightly when he passed it, how his gaze never lingered on the photograph for more than a second. These were not obvious things. They were the kind of details most people missed. But Lily did not miss them. She understood avoidance. She understood silence. Later that afternoon, Ethan made a decision. It was not impulsive. It was deliberate, calculated, and sharp with intention. If she believed she understood something about him, then he would force her to prove it. Or break it. Inside quietly, her posture composed but alert. "You wanted to see me," she said. Ethan did not answer immediately. He walked slowly across the room, stopping just a few feet away from her. Close enough to feel the presence of another person. Close enough to test boundaries that had not yet been crossed. "You said you recognized loss," he began, his voice low, controlled. Lily did not respond right away. She held his gaze, waiting. "Then tell me something," he continued. "What do people do when they think they understand pain?" The question was not simple. It was not neutral. It was a challenge. Lily took a slow breath before answering. "Some people run from it," she said quietly. "Some people hide it. And some people try to control everything around them so they never have to feel it again." Ethan's expression hardened slightly, but he did not interrupt. "And which one are you?" he asked. Lily hesitated for the first time in a way that felt different. Not uncertain. "Careful. I used to run," she admitted softly. "But that does not work forever." Ethan took a step closer. "So what do you do now?" Lily's fingers moved slightly at her side again, brushing against the edge of the cloth she carried. Her eyes flickered downward for just a moment before returning to his. "Now I stay," she said, "even when it hurts." The answer hung in the air, heavier than anything else she had said before. Ethan watched her closely, searching, analyzing, trying to find the flaw, the weakness, the inconsistency that would restore his certainty. But it was not there. "Not confuse that with understanding me." Lily nodded slightly. "I am not confusing anything," she said. "I am just paying attention." Silence followed once more, but this time it was sharper, more charged, as if something had shifted beyond return. Ethan stood still, his back to her, his mind moving faster than his control could keep up with. This was no longer a simple test. It had not been for a while. But now, it had crossed into something else entirely. Something personal. Something he did not know how to manage. And that meant only one thing. The next move would not be subtle. It would not be quiet. "Why?" she said. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. This was the moment. The one that would prove everything he had believed from the beginning. "Because you have been dishonest," he said. Lily's brows furrowed faintly, the first visible crack in her composure. "I do not understand," she replied. Ethan stepped forward slowly, closing the distance between them with deliberate control. "You said you recognized something about me," he continued, "not controlled, but hollow, as if something had been removed that he had not realized was there until it was gone." In the hallway, Lily paused briefly near the small sitting room, her gaze drifting once more to the photograph she had cleaned days before. Her hand lifted slightly, brushing against the worn cloth she always carried. But this time, she did not stop. She did not linger. She simply continued forward, leaving behind the one place where she had unknowingly changed everything. And back in the living room, Ethan Cole stood alone, the certainty he had fought to protect now surrounded by a silence that felt far more dangerous than doubt. The door closed behind Lily with a soft, final sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. For a moment, the entire penthouse stood still, as if the space itself had noticed her absence. Ethan Cole did not move. He remained in the center of the room, his posture unchanged, his expression as controlled as ever. This was what he had decided. This was what he had chosen. And yet, the silence that followed did not feel like control. It felt like something had been taken from him without permission. Hours passed, though time inside the penthouse no longer moved in a way that felt normal. Years sealing shut. And yet, the more he tried to reassert that reasoning, the less convincing it felt. Something did not align. Something did not settle. His steps carried him toward the smaller sitting room before he consciously decided to go there. He had avoided it for days, for reasons he did not want to acknowledge. Slightly around the bracelet, the edges pressing into his palm as if grounding him in a reality he could no longer deny. And in that moment, the certainty he had clung to, the belief that everyone had a hidden motive, that kindness was always a transaction, shattered completely. Because the one person who had been real, who had asked for nothing, who had seen him without knowing who he was the person he had just pushed out of his life. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, the weight of that realization settling deeper than anything he had felt in years. This was not a test anymore. This was a mistake. And for the first time, he did not know if it was something he could fix. The realization did not fade with time. It deepened. It settled into Ethan Cole with a weight he could not ignore, no matter how hard he tried to regain control. He stood alone in the sitting room, the hospital bracelet still in his hand, the worn fabric resting against his palm as if it carried years of unspoken truth. His mind replayed everything now, but differently. Every moment, every word, every quiet action Lily had taken inside his home. None of it had been random. None of it had been calculated for gain. It had all come from somewhere real. Somewhere he had refused to see. He closed his hand slowly around the bracelet, his jaw tightening as something unfamiliar pressed against his chest. Regret. Not the distant kind he had learned to suppress, but something immediate, sharp, and impossible to dismiss. He had not just been wrong. He had been cruel to the one person who had understood him without asking for anything in return. Ethan moved quickly then, the stillness that had defined him breaking into something urgent. He left the room, crossing the penthouse with a pace that no longer matched the controlled rhythm he had built his life around. By the time he reached the entrance, his assistant was already on the phone in the background, but Ethan did not wait. "Find her," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for delay. "Now." The assistant turned, startled by the intensity in his tone. "Sir, I will need more information," she said carefully. Ethan's hand tightened slightly at his side, the bracelet still held firmly. "Her name is Lily Carter,"